will also be made available on the website, and you'll be able to review the video if you want. So like I mentioned, today's agenda is to talk about what exactly Blazor is and how we can use it to create enterprise web applications. So we will first of all talk about what exactly Microsoft Blazor WebAssembly concept is. So we do have quite a few concepts to cover here, like what is Blazor, what is WebAssembly, and what is this overall Blazor WebAssembly. And then we will also compare it to Angular. So Angular is a very full-featured framework, and it will be very good to compare Blazor to Angular and see what are the characteristics or features of both these frameworks, and where one wins over the other framework, and this way we can decide what framework to use. And the reason we haven't included React here for comparison purpose is React is not a full-blown framework. The React is just a library that mostly focuses on organizing your views, and in order to make it more enterprise and more powerful, like when you have to add the support for routing and navigation, plus state management and so on, usually you end up relying on various other third-party extension libraries, like Redux. You get to use React Router, etc., and so on. So React is not a full-blown framework. It's just a library. And yes, you can make it more powerful by adding various other extension libraries if you want. Whereas Angular is a full-featured framework. So that is why we will compare Blazor to Angular. And then we will also talk about what exactly PWA, Progressive Web Apps concept is, and what are some of the features that you can enable when you use the PWA concept, and so on. Okay, so let's talk about what is Microsoft Blazor. And actually, even before we jump into this slide, let's first of all talk about what a typical web application is composed of and how it usually works. So typically, when we develop web applications, it will be a client-side application. It will be the front-end application, and it will heavily rely on technologies such as HTML, JavaScript, CSS for the look and feel, and we also get to add images and so on. And any end user will be able to use any browser to view the website. And the website, the front-end portion of the website, can never directly access a database because your databases will be on the server side. So it's not possible for a web browser-based application to directly connect to your database server that's hosted on the server side. So typically we end up creating some server-side code as well, the backend code. The backend code wise, it's up to you. You can choose to use any model view controller based technique like ASP.NET MVC. You can choose to use Node.js based REST services on the side. You can choose to use a .NET Web API if you want. You can choose to utilize a Spring Boot with Java to create your REST APIs or the backend portion. So the backend portion will basically be allowed to connect to the database server and expose the functionality of the database tables in the form of service endpoints. So typically REST APIs, they are service endpoints. We get to use various methods such as get, post, put, delete, and so on. And the front-end application, the web browser-based application on the client side, will be able to make some requests over the network, and your request will be fulfilled by the server side, like it will send some response. And typically, as a data interchange format, we mostly prefer JSON these days. Otherwise, it's up to you. You can choose to use XML as well. And definitely on the server side, you can choose to use some other technologies, like you can choose to use something called gRPC. That's a different way of implementing your server side or the backend code. But here we will mostly assume that we have REST APIs, because REST APIs, they are the most commonly utilized when it comes to exposing your server-side functionality over the network. So basically, your typical web application will be composed of these technologies. And when you have to develop an enterprise application, it will most likely be fairly complex. There will be lots of pages, lots of things will be involved, lots of fillable forms will be involved. So how do you maintain the code? How do you make sure that your HTML, the view, and your logic is organized and it's easy for us to maintain the application? So that is where most frameworks like Angular, Backbone, even libraries such as Vue.js, Polymer Web Components, React, including Blazor. Blazor is actually not a library, it's a framework. So all these frameworks slash libraries, they encourage us to organize our application code in such a way that it should be easy for us to maintain the application in the long run. So enterprise applications should be maintainable. We should be able to maintain them in the long run. And later on, I'll talk about this diagram. We will talk about how exactly Blazor WebAssembly lets us organize our application in the form of components, services, pages, and so on. But in short, the goal is to organize our view as well as the code that should be responsible for connecting to the server backend. So keeping this in mind, let's talk about Blazor. Let me switch back to my slide deck. So what is Blazor? So Blazor is a technology from Microsoft. It's a framework that is used to develop single page applications. Or simply put, you can say you can develop your front end applications, the web browser sort of applications, the client applications. And it's totally open source. And if you guys are familiar with ASP.NET MVC, it does let you implement the front end portion, like you use Razor along with some server side controllers and so on. So overall, it's somewhat similar when you compare it to ASP.NET MVC, but there are lots of differences as well. And that's what we will talk about in detail in just a bit, like what it offers when it comes to developing your front end application. So overall, Blazor is an open source, free of cost framework that is used to develop single page applications. And single page application basically means you will literally have a single physical HTML file in your entire website. So back in the day, we used to have lots of ASPX pages. Or if you talk about, let's say, ASP.NET MVC, we usually still have lots of views. They are bound to various controllers. So when you access some controller, it will return us some view. So overall, you still have lots of CS HTML sort of files. You have HTML files and so on. So in case of single page application, rather than having lots of physical views or physical pages, when you build your application and you're ready to deploy your application on the production environment, you will have exactly one physical file that or a HTML file that is index.html. And everything else, like your various forms, like user login, user registration, shopping cart, checkout sort of forms, they will be logical pages. They will be views. They will not be physical files. They will be views, and we will swap out the views dynamically on the page. So basically, overall, you'll get to create your page layout. Like you will have your page header, you will have your page footer, you will have your navigation menu, and you'll say that these will remain static. And just this section in blue should be dynamic. So depending on the anchor or the hyperlink you have clicked on, it should either show user login, user registration, shopping cart, checkout, and so on. So basically, we just swap out sections on the page. So it's a single page application framework. And it heavily utilizes Razor. So Razor is the same ASP.NET MVC specific technology. But unlike .cs HTML extension that we use in ASP.NET MVC, here we use .razor file extension. And it basically allows you to mix and match HTML code and your C# code. So you'll be able to utilize your for each loop, while loop, do while loop, if condition as part of your HTML page. So this way you can conditionally display some data on your web page or loop through some collection and display a table with a bunch of records and so on. So it does heavily rely on Razor views where you can write your C# code along with HTML. And another thing that is used when you utilize Blazor is WebAssembly concept. So WebAssembly is not a Microsoft specific technology. It's a generic web-oriented technology, like various other technologies use this WebAssembly concept. And what it basically means is that your web browser, or let me do it here, so your web browser is not limited to just JavaScript as the programming language. So since the very beginning, we have been taught that JavaScript is the only uh, programming language that is recognized by the web browsers. So it's no longer true. So your web browser, the relatively modern web browsers like Chrome, Microsoft Edge, Firefox, Safari, and so on, they have the ability to utilize something called WebAssembly. Now, what exactly is this WebAssembly? The WebAssembly is basically any language-based code, like it could be Python code, it could be C++ code, it can be C# as well. So it can be pretty much any language-based code, and the browser is allowed to execute these additional languages or the code that's written in these languages. So when you use Blazor, you will get to use C# on the client side. That is mind-blowing concept. C# on the client side. So usually we are taught that C# is a server-side language. That's no longer true. So you're able to utilize C# in your front-end application these days because of this WebAssembly concept. So basically, you'll end up having your C# code. It will be compiled into a .dll file or files, depending on how you have written your logic. And this will be downloaded by the browser on the client side. And definitely, it will still be able to use HTML, JavaScript, CSS images. And on top of it, it will be able to execute your C# code as well. So the client-side browser can now execute C# code. Why would you want to execute C#? We will talk about that as well in just a bit. But generally speaking, if you're not a fan of JavaScript, you don't want to learn JavaScript from scratch because you're a server-side programmer, you know Java, you know C#, and you don't want to go through the learning curve of learning JavaScript from scratch, knowing what is ES5, ES6, ES7 variations of JavaScript, you can use C#. So basically, it allows you to use C# on the client side. And so like I mentioned that you can use C# both on the front end and the back end. So this is a big game changer because you no longer have to invest too much time learning JavaScript or TypeScript sort of languages. And since Blazor is heavily reliant on the newer editions of .NET, not the traditional old one that is known as .NET Framework, instead it utilizes either .NET Core or .NET 5, that is currently the latest version of .NET. So these editions, .NET Core or .NET 5, these are cross-platform. So they run on the Windows platform, on Mac OS, on any Linux distribution as well, and so on. So basically, it's a cross-platform technology, unlike .NET Framework that is just based on the Windows-based, or you can just develop for the Windows. So here we will assume that we have the latest edition of .NET. Like on my machine, I have .NET 5, but you can use .NET Core as well if you want. But moving forward, you'll just want to utilize .NET 5. Next year, we will have .NET 6, and these are all cross-platform. And in fact, .NET Framework, .NET Core, they will both eventually phase out. Okay, so WebAssembly, we talked about this already, that it's basically a mechanism or the ability of a browser to execute non-JavaScript code on the client side. So you can execute Python code, C# code, C++ code, and so on, depending on the technology you're utilizing. So Blazor, out of the box, it lets you execute C# code from the client side. And since it's able to execute it from the client side, it means that the performance will be super fast. So your web application will be very, very fast because it's going to run the code natively. That's not interpreted language. It's not like traditional JavaScript. It is a compiled language. It's basically the regular C# code, and it's basically executed by your browser. So it gives you top-notch performance. And it still lets you execute JavaScript code. Like if you have C# code, you can still say that your C# code should be allowed to execute some JavaScript code, or vice versa. Your JavaScript code can also execute C# code. So there is JavaScript interoperability available when you use Blazor. So this way, there are certain features that still require JavaScript, like if you have to use some advanced features that we'll talk about later on, such as push notifications, or you want to utilize client-side databases such as IndexedDB that can let you store several GB of data on the client side to cache data that you have received from the REST APIs and so on. You can store it on the client side. So there are certain technologies that still require JavaScript. Mostly you get to write code in C#, but there are still certain technologies that require a bit of JavaScript. So that is why there is JS interop option available in Blazor. So this way you can execute C# from JavaScript and vice versa as well. So basically, Blazor WebAssembly, let me actually discuss this one. So Blazor WebAssembly is the ability to execute C# code from the client side. And you still get to use your HTML, CSS sort of files to create your views and so on. And another good thing about Blazor WebAssembly is that it gives you two options. You can choose to deploy or host your applications on a traditional web server such as IIS, or you can choose to build your application in such a way that it shouldn't rely on any traditional web server at all. So for example, we have something that is known as static file hosting or static hosting. So static hosting, for example, if you talk about Microsoft Azure, so there you can create a storage account where you can store regular files and folders. So you can just copy paste your built version of your application, sort of equivalent to the bin folder, and usually it's actually called a www root folder here. So you just take that folder, just copy it, just place it in your storage account on Azure, and you just select a single checkbox. You say that you want to support static file hosting, and that is it. So without installing and configuring any full-blown web server or application server, you can just use the static file hosting concept and host your Blazor WebAssembly application. And your client browser will be able to connect to that particular host and download all the necessary files. That includes your index.html file. It also includes your Blazor WebAssembly DLL files, and it will be able to execute the application. So basically, once the application is compiled, the WebAssembly portion of your application that will be in C# in this Blazor technology will be executable by any browser, or I should rather say any near browser, such as Chrome, Firefox, Microsoft Edge. But if you're using the dated Internet Explorer, then no, it will not support this WebAssembly concept. So WebAssembly is supported by the newer browsers. So basically, hosting wise, you have two options, either hosted on a regular web server, or you can choose to use the static file hosting concept, or you can also choose to deploy your application on Docker container and also use Kubernetes to implement failover cluster sort of concept, and also enable load balancing and so on. And like we discussed previously, Blazor utilizes C#. Even on the client side, you get to use C#. So usually we use it on the server side, but now you'll be able to use it on the client side as well. And usually what do you do in C# is you implement your event handlers, like button click, mouse move sort of events will be implemented here in C#. Plus, you'll be able to write code in C# to call your REST APIs. So if you are already familiar with C#, you already know a bunch of classes, like you know how to use the HTTP client class. You'll be able to call the REST APIs with ease. You don't need to learn anything new at all. And even if you're coming from the Java background, overall C# has somewhat similar syntax. So again, you'll find it very easy to utilize. Unlike using JavaScript, where you have to learn the whole language and learn about promise objects, how to use the fetch API, and so many different other weird syntaxes are available in JavaScript. So you won't have to go through that steep learning curve at all, because you'll be able to use C# on the client side. And views, the user interface portion will still be written in HTML, and you'll still use CSS, or in fact, out of the box, Blazor comes with Bootstrap. So if you use Bootstrap as the CSS framework, it's baked into Blazor. It's available out of the box. But if you don't like Bootstrap, you can choose to remove that from the auto-generated code, and you can choose to swap it with something else like Angular, or sorry, Material, or some other CSS framework. And it also uses the Razor technology. Like, you'll end up having .razor file extensions, and that is where you'll be able to mix and match HTML code and your C# code. And you can still write JavaScript code, especially for technologies or features that are not currently available in C#. For example, push notifications or index DB, etc., and so on. But slowly and gradually, lots of additional libraries are getting created. They're available on NuGet.org website, the same NuGet package manager that we use as .NET developers. So there are various libraries available, and slowly and gradually, you will eventually have support for push notifications in C# and so on. So the main benefit is being able to use C# on the client side in the front end application. That's a major benefit here compared to any other framework that always forces you to learn a new language like TypeScript, or you have to learn various versions of JavaScript like ES5, ES6, ES7, and so on. So here you just use C#. And since you get to use C# on the server side as well, so if you're already a server-side developer, you use C#, you'll be able to use the same language, the same syntax on the client side as well. And in fact, you'll be able to share some code. So typically, your server side and the client side, they usually have to send and receive data in JSON format, and usually we have to serialize and deserialize data. So the classes, the models that you're sharing between the server side and the client side can be written in the same language. In fact, you can just create a reusable class library project and just share it across the server side and the front end portion of your application. So basically, this is a major benefit, and it's a game changer. You don't have to learn JavaScript that much these days. And let's compare it to Angular. Question, how many guys have used Angular or seen Angular before? If you could please raise your hand in this webinar software. This way I can discuss Angular accordingly. So if you have used Angular in the past, you can raise your hand. Okay, so some of you guys have used it. That's good. Okay, so if you have used Angular in the past, usually to create a new Angular application, we use the npm command line tool. Npm install, we install this Angular CLI tool. So once we have installed the command line interface tool, it will basically end up creating or downloading a file called ng, short for Angular, and we can create a new application like this. Then just switch to the folder and just use ng serve command. It will host your application in a development server, and you'll be able to test your application and so on. And in case of Blazor, you can do the same thing or something similar. In fact, you have two options. So either use Visual Studio, go to File, New Project, and search for Blazor. So you can search for Blazor. It will show you the Blazor template. Or if you say that, no, I do not usually install Visual Studio, and actually I'm one of the culprits, I do not usually install the full-blown Visual Studio. because I use Visual Studio Code. That is open source. It's a small cut down version of Visual Studio. It's barely 300 megabytes in size, whereas Visual Studio is about 20 GB in size. So if you are mostly a fan of using a Visual Studio Code along with the command line, you can do something similar. So you can choose to use .NET New, use this template, Blazor WebAssembly, and whatever your project name you want to utilize here. Switch to the folder, and this one small typo, it's .NET Run. The .NET Run command will basically run your application. And let me show you this thing practically here. So I can switch to my command prompt here. I can create a new project here, so .NET New. Make sure you specify the template name as it is, Blazor WebAssembly. And I want to name it whatever, like sales project or whatever the project name is. So this will basically generate the boilerplate code for us, the template. So this is equivalent to saying file new project and search for Blazor WebAssembly in Visual Studio. And just switch to the folder. We already have a bunch of files and folders that represents our base project or the boilerplate or the template sort of project. And for now, I won't bother making any changes to this particular project. I already have my other demo that I'll show you in just a bit. For now, I'm just going to run it. So before running it, you can choose to build it like this, or even if you don't build it, you just run it. It will build the application and also host it for you automatically. So I'm building my application, then I can use .NET Run. And you can also optionally specify a custom port number if you don't want to use the default port number. That is typically 5000. So I can, let's say, choose to change it to 9999. So I'm hosting my application in .NET's built-in web server. That's actually very good. It's production ready. It's based on an open source engine called Kestrel. So Kestrel is the open source engine used by this .NET Run command. And typically, this is what we do, especially when we have to deploy our application inside a Docker container, and we later on need to host it on Kubernetes and so on. So we usually run the exact same command, .NET Run, to start the built-in web server that is available in .NET. So basically, we have our application up and running. Now you can choose to switch to your browser, navigate to that particular URL, 9999. This is the default look and feel of the auto-generated project. So here we can see a bunch of pages. So in reality, these are not physical pages. In reality, we have just a single HTML file that is index.html. And this part is part of the template. It's our static portion. So we have the sidebar here with the navigation menu, and we have this top link bar as well. This is also static. And only this section is usually refreshed depending on what link you click on. So since we overall have a single index.html page, so that is why we usually say that it's a single page application framework, because we just dynamically swap out certain section on the page depending on the requirement. So you can create a new project with ease, and definitely there are lots of details involved, like how it's configured and so on. But in this short session, I won't go into too much depth. For now, we just want to compare it to Angular and see some of the aspects and decide whether we should go with Angular or with Blazor when it comes to picking a full-featured framework. Now, both Angular and Blazor, they are full-featured front-end application frameworks. They're full-featured. They contain pretty much everything that is needed to develop your client-side application. So for example, they allow us to organize the user interface. They allow us to use various other techniques to organize the UI by utilizing something that is known as a component. So pretty much all frameworks and libraries, including Blazor, Angular, Backbone, Vue.js, Polymer Web Components, React, they all allow us to create components to organize the UI. So what's the meaning of components? So those guys who are familiar with it, well and good. Those who aren't, let me talk about this components concept first. So Traditionally, we hard code or HTML code like this. So let's say we have index.html page. There we will say we have some heading that's supposed to act as our page header. We have some navigation menu. We have some body of our page. Like in this case, I'm planning to display the user login sort of form, and we have some footer as well. So rather than hard coding your raw low-level HTML tags like this, all frameworks and libraries that allows to create enterprise web applications, they encourage us to organize these in the form of components. And each component is essentially a custom tag. Like I have a custom tag named app header, app menu, app body, app footer. So these are all custom tags. So a custom tag is also known as a component, and its responsibility is to organize the small bits and pieces or fragments of our web page. So this app header under the hood, it will be a .razor file. And for now, we just have the HTML portion. We don't have any C# code. I'll talk about the C# portion later on. So basically, we are storing just this HTML fragment in this app header.razor file. And likewise, app menu contains this HTML fragment. So we have our menu portion. Likewise, we have the footer as well. And we also have this, let's say, app body, or you can just name it user login at this point. So we have this user login. And in advanced scenarios, we can parameterize our components. So for example, here I'm passing username text and password text as sort of the input parameters to this user login component. And this user login component at the bottom level, at the root level, will utilize the regular HTML sort of tags, and you can utilize a bit of C# code where we could use the @ symbol. So the @ symbol allows us to execute some C# piece of code as well. So in short, components, they are custom tags. So this way, when you look at your high-level code, it will make sense. You will know what exactly is happening. So rather than looking at your raw HTML tags and then guess what's the purpose of certain lines of code, like, okay, we have this paragraph, we have input type equals text, okay, username is there, then password is there, and then we have this button, and then you'll say that, oh, this is the user login form. So rather than interpreting too much stuff manually, when you organize it in the form of components, you're making your application more enterprise and easy to maintain in the long run. So components, they are essential in pretty much uh, any framework or library, like I named it previously, Blazor, Angular, React, Polymer Web Components, Vue.js, and there are so many other frameworks and libraries as well. So basically, Angular, Blazor, they both allow us to utilize the components concept. And in more advanced cases, you can also pass data between components, like we can nest components. The parent level component can pass data to the child level components. So you can nest components and pass data around. Both Angular and React let you do that. And both Angular and React, they let you create fillable forms and also implement data validation. So fillable forms, so that you bind your data, or usually we call it model. So model should be bound to our visual elements, the view. So data binding, like you will have some C# piece of code that I'll show you in just a bit, and you'll be able to bind the properties of your class to any visual element, like your text field, password field, radio button, checkbox, drop-down control, list box, and so on. So basically being able to bind data, that is one of the core characteristics of any full-featured framework such as Angular and React and Blazor. So you can create your fillable forms by using the data binding concept. And you can also implement data validation as well. So let me briefly show you a demo here where I have a simple fillable form. Okay, so here I have a simple fillable form. It's the user login sort of scenario. We don't care for the actual credentials at this point. But if I do not enter anything here and I click the login button here, you can see that it's showing us the error messages here. So both Angular and Blazor, they have built-in out-of-the-box options to allow us to create fillable forms, and they also support data validation as well. Now, if you compare the code for an Angular application and a Blazor application, there's a huge difference. So let me show you the sample code that's usually required when it comes to creating your Angular application, and then I'll show you the equivalent code in Blazor as well. And then you'll see how many lines of code we had to write in Angular versus how many versus Blazor and Sun. So typically in Angular, when you want to create your components, like maybe you want to create your component named user login that should act as a custom tag. And under the hood, it should render the input fields for text, for the username, for the password, and also for the button as well. So typically in case of Angular, we organize our components in 3 separate files. So whatever the name of your component is, .component.css will contain your cascaded style sheets or your look and feel portion of your view. And the actual HTML tags that you need to render as part of your component will be stored in this, whatever your component name is, .html. And sort of the code behind, like button click, mouse move, sort of logic, will be written in TypeScript format. So Angular uses TypeScript, although you can use JavaScript as well, but out of the box, Angular uses TypeScript that is later on compiled to JavaScript. Your code behind portion for your button click, mouse move sort of events or text change sort of events will be there in this .ts file. And if you look at the sample code here for a very simple component named hello world, that should just display this sort of output. So we should have some label, we should have some text field, and whatever data you type in here, it should be displayed in some other label as well. So we need to create a very simple application. So in Angular, usually you'll want to, first of all, create your code behind part so you can specify the model, the classes, or the data that you need to bind to your view. So before you create the actual view, typically we prefer creating our code behind part. So the goal here is not to memorize the entire code or even discuss the entire or every line of code here, but the goal is to just focus on how many lines we had to write here in case of Angular, and we will later on compare it to Blazor. So notice that there's some import statement. We are using some decorator here to say that this is the custom tag name. We are specifying what HTML to render, what CSS file to utilize with that HTML. Then we have some class. We have some model or the data that we need to bind to this visual field. And then we have the component lifecycle event on ng on init. So this is called whenever you execute your application and your component is getting loaded, it will call that. So typically this is where you'll want to call your REST APIs so you can obtain data from the server side. And we have a custom function here. We want to treat this as not exactly a button click sort of event, but as on key, on input. So when we change the text of this text field, we need to execute this custom piece of code. So we are basically obtaining the value from the text field and we're storing it in this custom variable here. So we had to write quite a few lines of code here for the code behind part. And the view of this Angular specific component will be something like this. So we have input, we are using the event handling part like this. So key up, this is a standard HTML/JavaScript event, and we want to hook it up to this particular on key custom event or a custom function. So we are hooking up the event to this event handler. And for data binding purpose, we are using this convention in Angular. We have curly braces, and we are saying whatever the name or value of this particular name variable is, we need to display that here on the view. So basically, you will end up creating your code behind portion of your component and the HTML portion. And once you have your component created, you can use it like this. So now you just have to use this custom tag name app-hello world as a tag like this, and this will basically render the output for us. So basically we have organized our view in the form of small fragments or components. Currently we have just a single component, but in real world scenario you will have user login component, shopping cart component, user registration component, address component or billing address, shipping address, and so on. So you'll end up creating lots of components. Now let's compare it to Blazor. So in case of Blazor, you have two options. You can make it absolutely easy by creating just a single file for the entire component. You can just name your file whatever you want, .razor. And this can contain both your HTML portion and also your C# sort of logic as well. Or if you want to say that, no, I want to organize it, I want to separate the view from my code behind part. So in that case, you can split it into two separate files like this. So .razor will represent your view, the HTML portion, and your .cs file will represent your code behind sort of portion where you'll have your logic in C#. You can choose to separate your view from your HTML or from your C# sort of logic. And your style sheet for the component, like you want to change the background color, forecolor, and so on, that will be in hello world, whatever the name of the file is, .razor.css. So basically you can choose to make it very easy by just creating a single Razor file, or you can choose to split it into two separate files so you can organize your view and your C# code. Now let's look at the actual logic. This is what we have. That is it. This is all we need in Blazor. Before I show you this in more detail, look at what we had to do in Angular. Even in case of React, it's quite a few lines of code that we have to write. So basically there's just too much going on here. It's very verbose. It's too descriptive here. Whereas when you want to accomplish the same thing by using Blazor, you will have your .razor file where you can have your view, the HTML code, and also your C# code as well. So for the C# code, we just use add code block, and you just start writing your C# code here. And your HTML portion in this .razor file will mostly make use of your standard HTML tags, and you'll be able to use some Blazor specific techniques or C# sort of code as well. So for example, here we are using just the @ symbol to say that we want to get the value of this particular name variable and display it here. And this is usually also known as one-way data binding. So one-way means the value of this variable will be displayed in a static manner on the page as part of the span tag. So the end user cannot modify the value because it's a read-only sort of label. It's not an interactive field. And for two-way data binding, where you want to make things interactive so that the end user should be able to modify the value of some field, and the value of the field should be stored back in the underlying variable, we get to use this @bind -value and just specify the name of your variable that you want to bind to this particular text field. Optionally, you can also specify a custom event if you want, or use some out-of-the-box event as well. So here we are using just the standard on input event. So we are saying that we should see the changes in the text field in sort of a live manner. The moment you type in anything here, it should start showing you the updated text right away. Otherwise, without this, by default, you will have to switch focus to some other field before this variable will be populated. So in short, you can choose to make it live, or you can say that, no, I'll just have to press the tab key, then I want to capture the value and then store it in my variable. You can choose to use either of these techniques. But overall, notice that your C# code and your HTML code is very, very clean. It's much simpler compared to Angular. It's doing the same thing. And to use your component, whatever your file name is, you just use that file name as the tag name. And Blazor will know that you're trying to render the contents of this particular component. So basically, this is another major difference between Angular and Blazor, that Blazor is much cleaner. It lets you do the exact same thing, but in less lines of code. So Angular is just way too verbose. Yes, once you get used to it, all these lines, they make sense, but it's just too verbose. That's the drawback in case of Angular, whereas in case of Blazor, it's much cleaner. And even when it comes to calling your server-side code, like your REST API sort of code, like we discussed previously, that usually your server-side code will be executed from the client side so that it can obtain the data from the database server and render it on the HTML page. So to call your REST APIs, if you first of all look at Angular-based example here, so typically in Angular, you have to create a service. A service is essentially just a reusable function or a reusable class. And in more advanced cases, we use another term, dependency injection. That means that we want to reuse some service from some component. So basically here we have this custom function. In this case, we have tickets sort of scenario. So we want to obtain all tickets. So in case of Angular, we need to know what is this observable concept. It's actually a part of JavaScript as well. In JavaScript, we also call it the promise object. So we need to know this relatively weird syntax and name. We need to understand what is this thing. And then we have to call the http.get function and specify what REST API you want to send the request to. And then your component will most likely use some event like button click event or component load event. And there you will have to call this particular custom function, get tickets, and then use the subscribe concept. So subscribe and then obtain the data. And then once you have the data, now you can display it in your view or on your view in your HTML portion by using this ng-for directive. This is a part of Angular. You need to learn quite a few different syntaxes and concepts here. In case of Angular, what is observable? What is the subscribe concept? What is this ng-for? Whereas if you want to do the exact same thing in Blazor, this is all we will have to write. Here we are choosing to include the standard not HTML, but .NET class called HTTP client. HTTP client class exists in .NET. In fact, it has been existing since forever. And you'll get to use this to call your REST APIs. So in our C# portion of our code, we are creating a regular C# based or using the regular syntax here to create an array, or it can be some list of as well. And here we are using this component lifecycle function called onInitialized async. It means this function will be executed whenever your component is about to get rendered or it's about to get initialized. So here we are using the standard HTTP client object, and we are calling it standard function called get from JSON async. And we are specifying the URL here. We obtain the data, and your HTML portion is using mostly C#. So this is this is a C# piece of code, and we are able to use it as part of our HTML portion. So for each, it's your regular C# code. And just because we have used the @ symbol here, your HTML portion will be able to execute your C# code. And then we are choosing to render the div tag, and we want to display whatever the ticket.title is for each ticket. So ticket is basically will be a class, and it will have a property called title, and we are just looping through all the tickets that we have in this array, and we are displaying the ticket title for all the tickets. So basically, concepts-wise, there are less concepts to learn here because it's mostly C#, and we are already familiar with most of these concepts because if we are a server-side developer, we usually know most of these concepts. Like even async and await, it's not a new technique. It has been existing in .NET since forever. So it's an asynchronous programming technique to make sure that our application doesn't hang up at all. It should run things in the background. So the number of lines of code you have to write here, the number of concepts you have to learn here, they are far less compared to other technologies. Like in case of React, you will have to learn the fetch API, or you can use jQuery. In case of Angular, out of the box, we have the HTTP client class, but we need to understand what is observable, what is subscribe concept, and so on. So basically, C# on the client side in Blazor makes things much easier, and you're still able to do the same things. And in case of Blazor, another benefit is that you can share your models. So if you have your server-side code and your client-side code, like we have this here, server-side and the client-side, if they are both using C# in Blazor, you can create a common library, a common class library, and you can say you want to store your models there. Like you'll say that we will have, let's say, class user. You will have properties like username and password and so on, and they should both be available on the server side and the client side. Because in the database server, you will most likely have a table named user or users. So usually you'll want to create a class to represent that table that should be there on the server side, and you also need to create it on the client side as well. So being able to reuse your classes across the server side and the backend, that is another benefit you get with Blazor. So basically, Angular versus Blazor, they are both full-featured frameworks. Sure, no doubt, Angular is a bit more mature. Like it came out in 2008 or so, the very first version. So it does have sort of a bit of edge over Blazor in that regards. And toolset wise, it does come with the command line tool called ng that lets you create components, services. You can use or create directives, pipes, etc., and so on by using the command line tool. And although it does let you use TypeScript, that is much easier to understand compared to just the vanilla JavaScript. But still, there's some steep learning curve involved when it comes to learning Angular concepts and also learning the TypeScript language. So overall, Angular requires steep learning curve. Plus, you have to write lots of additional lines of code because the code is very verbose. It has to be verbose. You need to write too many things by hand. Whereas in Blazor, you write less lines of code. So less lines of code are required because most of the stuff is understood by Blazor that you need to create a component. So why bother forcing you to write too many lines of code to say that it's a component? Why not just use some conventions to make things easier? You'll get to use C# on the client side in Blazor with less lines of code. You can use all the, or pretty much most of your NuGet packages. You can reuse all the logic that you have in C# and so on. Plus, the performance is very good because Blazor WebAssembly uses the WebAssembly concept. It means that the code will be compiled into .dll files, and it will be downloaded by the browser and executed by the browser on the client side. So that's why the performance will be very good. Drawback wise, you could say that it's a new framework, so it will take a bit of time if you need to look at the actual figures, like you want to go to Google Trends and see what's the most popular library or framework, then obviously Blazor will not show up on the top at this point because Angular has been existing since forever. So it's a relatively new framework, but it's becoming very mature. In fact, more support is getting added for even the native mobile applications as well, and so on. So it's becoming very popular. It's learning gradually. And another minor drawback you could say is that the initial download is slightly large. So when the user types in a URL to your Blazor application, the first time download will be slightly large compared to Angular. But once that has been downloaded, things will be top notch because your client side will or your browser will basically cache the files on the client side, and things will run at a very fast pace. And Blazor can be combined with another concept that is known as progressive web apps. The progressive web apps it has nothing to do with Blazor, but you can choose to use it with Blazor. In fact, you can choose to use progressive web apps concept with any other web development framework, like with Angular, with React, with just the standard HTML and JavaScript, and so on. And the purpose of progressive web apps is to be able to use or develop a single web application that should be installable as a desktop app. So let me show you this in practically, since we don't have too much time here. So here I have a Blazor specific application. It's using Blazor behind the scene. So here I can go to my URL and access the website. Or if I enable PWA features, progressive web apps features, I'll be able to see this download option in the browser. In the relatively newer browsers, we will see this install option. So no other website will ever show this install option. Only the PWA enabled websites, progressive web apps features, when we have them enabled, only then you will see this install option. And you'll be able to install it as a desktop app. And you don't need that browser. You can just look at this desktop version of the application now. You can, in fact, see it in your start menu. So we have this custom Blazing Pizza app here. You can choose to add it to your start menu. You can choose to add pin it to your taskbar. You can launch it from here as if it's a regular desktop application. But in reality, it's still a web application. So it's just using a wrapper or sort of a shell that looks like a desktop application. And your desktop application, once you have enabled the PWA features here, you'll be able to utilize the push notification concept. So for example, here we have this pizza ordering sort of a sample application. I can choose to place some pizza order. I can also allow this application to show me push notifications. So the user will have to allow the push notifications, and I can now enter any random data here, dummy data, and I can place some pizza order. I can even close the application or just minimize it and do whatever I want. And whenever the pizza order has been dispatched, we will see this push notification here. And whenever we have the pizza order has been delivered, we will see another push notification. And I can click on the push notification. It will show us the order details. So what order got delivered, when exactly it was placed, and so on. So push notifications and this desktop look and feel of the application. These are some of the features of any progressive web app sort of application. So PWA is a generic concept that that can work with Blazor. It can also work with non-Blazor applications as well. But typically, to modernize our Blazor applications, we do enable the PWA, progressive web apps features. So this way, you'll have push notification, you'll have desktop sort of experience. You'll also be able to create offline web applications. Offline web applications. So in order to create offline applications, we can assume that we already have the application executed once. It has already connected to the server side. It has downloaded the data from the server side, and it has stored it on the client side by using the modern technologies such as IndexedDB. IndexedDB is a client-side database, not a server side, but a client side that can let you store several GB of data. That's just mind-blowing. So you can cache data on the client side. You can say that when we don't have the internet connection, we should still be able to launch this desktop version of the same web application. It's a seamless application that acts as a web application and also as a desktop application. And it can utilize the cached copy of the data that we have in our IndexedDB database and just display the data here, even without having the network connection. And Gmail is actually one of the very good examples of offline application. So when you get a chance, go to your gmail.com website, log in, go to settings, and just go through various settings. Eventually, you'll see the option where it will let you select a checkbox, and you will be able to say that I want to download all my emails on the client side. And once you have it configured for offline usage, Even if you do not have the internet connection, just go to gmail.com. It will still show you all your emails in an offline mode. You'll still be able to create new emails, delete the emails, and whenever you have the internet connection, it will synchronize the changes back with the server side. So basically, with PWA, we can enable these features that are usually available just with the desktop applications. So Blazor is no exception here. It's a web application framework, and it lets you enable these features. So we have seen that when you don't have the network connection, you can enable the offline mode. Plus, you can also install your application and work with it as if it's a regular desktop application. Okay, so in a nutshell, Blazor is a very competitive framework. It's really awesome. If you're a C# developer or .NET developer, you'll feel right at home. There's next to no learning curve here. You just have to know some of the basics of Blazor, how things work, and you can get up and running with it. Okay, so we do have a course on Blazor. So, you can see the course number here, WA3064, Progressive Web App Development using Blazor. So we do have this course available. If you have any interest, you can ask us for more details. So any question regarding this particular session? And I'm also going to paste the link to the slide deck in the chat window in case if you guys want to access it. It's there in the chat window. Okay, so thank you very much, guys. It was a pleasure to be here with you for this session.